Jonathan Roumie stepped onto the set of The Steve Harvey Show, and the atmosphere crackled with energy. The audience anticipated stories from The Chosen, a touch of humor, and the quiet sincerity of the man who portrays Jesus. Steve Harvey, with his signature grin, was ready to steer the conversation with his blend of wit and warmth. But as Jonathan took his seat, his gaze caught the crucifix around Steve's neck, and a subtle shift rippled through the studio. What promised to be a lighthearted interview was about to become a moment etched in memory, because in the next few minutes, Steve wouldn't be the one asking questions, he'd be the one fighting back tears. A single unexpected sentence from Jonathan would turn everything upside down, and it all began with a question no one saw coming. "Steve, can I share something I've never said publicly before?" But before the stage lights blazed, a shadow of prejudice had already crept in, threatening to derail this sacred moment. 3 days earlier, Jonathan was in his modest Chicago apartment, immersed in his morning prayers. The room spoke volumes about his life, bare walls adorned only with a wooden crucifix carved by his Lebanese grandmother. A faded photo of his father, who passed away believing his son would never succeed. And stacks of theology books, their pages worn from years of study. His kitchen table overflowed with letters from the chosen viewers, thanking him for bringing an authentic Jesus to a world rife with spiritual fakes. Jonathan had no interest in fame or fortune, turning down countless offers to monetize his holy role. But that day, a phone call halted his quiet routine. The voice belonged to Lisa Bennett, executive producer of The Steve Harvey Show. Her tone was icy, devoid of warmth, as she invited him to a special episode on inspiring figures. Jonathan knew of Steve, a gifted host who used humor and faith to touch millions. But Lisa's voice betrayed contempt. "We're aiming for diverse guests," she said, her words clipped, "but don't expect special treatment for playing Jesus or your Middle Eastern roots." The remark cut like a knife, targeting his faith and Lebanese heritage. Jonathan hesitated. He sensed the prejudice in her tone, as if she wanted him to fail to be reduced to a religious actor, ripe for mockery on air. Yet a quiet voice within urged him this was where God wanted him to be. He glanced around his apartment, where simplicity reigned. A 15-year-old Honda sat in the lot outside. His bank account rarely topped $2,000, but he needed no more. His faith lived in the crucifix, the viewer letters, and his personal bond with God. Lisa's invitation wasn't just a chance, it was a challenge. He knew he was stepping into an arena where bias and hostility might lurk, but he also believed God sometimes calls his people to the darkest places to shine. Jonathan prepared diligently. He rewatched episodes of The Steve Harvey Show, noting Steve's heartfelt faith-sharing, often mocked by media as overly emotional. But he also heard whispers about Lisa Bennett, a powerful producer notorious for controlling the show and disliking religious guests, especially someone like Jonathan, who openly embraced his Christian faith and Lebanese roots. An insider tip revealed Lisa had said in a meeting, "Let him come on, but I'll make sure he doesn't turn this into a sermon." The threat only strengthened Jonathan's resolve. If he went on air, he'd speak truth no matter how Lisa tried to twist his image. The night before the taping, Jonathan knelt on his apartment floor, praying for wisdom and courage. He thought of Jesus facing hostile crowds, speaking love despite scorn. He recalled moments of discrimination for his Lebanese heritage, or faith-suspicious glances, whispered slurs. But he also thought of viewers whose letters said his role helped them rediscover God. Jonathan accepted that this interview might be a trap set by Lisa, but he vowed silently, some truths are worth telling, whatever the cost. The next morning, he arrived at the Los Angeles studio. The professional yet chilly atmosphere struck him immediately. Walls displayed photos of Steve with celebrities, but the corridors buzzed with staff, whispers, some casting curious glances his way. Lisa greeted him with a forced smile, her voice sharp. "Don't try turning this into a church service, Mr. Roumie," she said, emphasizing his surname as if it carried a stain. "The audience wants entertainment, not preaching." Jonathan nodded politely, but inside he felt her intent to undermine him, to make him a laughingstock for his faith and heritage. In the green room, other guests, a retired athlete and a pop singer, chattered about promotional strategies. Jonathan sat quietly, clutching his worn copy of the Gospel of Luke. An assistant producer, perhaps unaware of Lisa's scheme, offered him a script with suggested questions, but Jonathan declined. "I just want to be honest," he said. The assistant looked surprised, as if unused to someone rejecting a chance to control their narrative. But Jonathan knew if Lisa wanted to trap him, that script was part of her plan. As the show began, Steve strode onto the stage, his radiant smile and warm voice igniting the crowd. He introduced Jonathan not just as the chosen star, but as a man bringing the light of faith to screens everywhere. The audience cheered, but Jonathan spotted Lisa in the wings, her eyes cold like a predator awaiting his misstep. Steve, oblivious to her plot, launched the conversation with genuine warmth. Yet Jonathan felt an invisible pressure from backstage, as if every word he spoke would be weaponized by Lisa against him. Taking his seat, his eyes met the crucifix on Steve's chest, and a wave of peace washed over him. He knew whatever Lisa planned, God had brought him here for a purpose. The interview was about to begin, and Jonathan silently prayed for words that would honor God and shatter the walls of prejudice. But he also knew one wrong move could let Lisa win, turning him into a failure before millions. The battle had begun, and the stage lights were only the start of a greater story. The studio of the Steve Harvey Show pulsed with anticipation as Jonathan Roumie sat across from Steve Harvey, his Bible resting quietly in his lap. The audience, expecting a blend of humor and Hollywood tales, leaned in, sensing an undercurrent of something deeper. Steve, with his warm grin, was ready to guide the conversation, unaware of the tension simmering backstage, where producer Lisa Bennett watched with a predator's gaze. Her plan was clear: twist Jonathan's faith in Lebanese heritage into a caricature, exposing him as a sanctimonious fraud before millions. But Jonathan, grounded by the crucifix glinting on Steve's chest, was prepared to speak truth no matter the cost. What began as a talk show segment was morphing into a battle of conviction against prejudice, and the next few minutes would set the stage for a reckoning no one saw coming. Steve kicked off with his signature charm, his voice rich with admiration. "Jonathan, you've brought Jesus to life in The Chosen in a way that's touched millions," he said, leaning forward. "What's the heart behind that work? What keeps you grounded?" The question was an open door inviting Jonathan to share his journey, but backstage Lisa's lips curled into a smirk. She'd coached Steve's team to start soft lulling Jonathan into a false sense of security before springing her trap, a series of loaded questions designed to make his faith seem rigid and his heritage suspect. She whispered to an assistant, "Let him preach. It'll make his fall sweeter." Jonathan paused, his eyes steady, sensing the unseen pressure. He knew Lisa was waiting for a misstep, ready to spin his words into a headline, "Actor's Religious Rant Derails Show." But he also felt a quiet strength, as if the crucifix on Steve's chest was a reminder of his purpose. "Steve," you appreciate that he began, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not about me or my work. It's about Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. Everything I do flows from knowing him, not from chasing fame or approval." The words landed with a gentle force, shifting the room's energy. The audience murmured, some nodding, others caught off guard by the unapologetic faith in his tone. Steve's eyes lit up, his preacher's instinct kicking in. "That's real talk right there," he said, clapping lightly. But Lisa in the wings scowled. She signaled the floor director to speed up, eager to pivot to her scripted questions. Steve, still unaware of her scheme, followed the teleprompter's nudge. "Now, Jonathan, you're known for your faith, but folks say you're pretty intense about it. Some even call you, what's the word, zealous?" The question planted by Lisa carried a subtle jab, implying his devotion was excessive, perhaps alienating. The audience shifted, sensing the shift in tone, while Lisa's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Jonathan recognized the bait. Lisa wanted him to defend himself, to sound defensive or dogmatic. Instead, he smiled softly, his voice unwavering. "If zealous means loving Jesus with all my heart, then I'm guilty," he said. "But my faith isn't about judging others. It's about sharing the love that saved me." The audience relaxed, some clapping drawn to his sincerity. Steve nodded, visibly moved, but Lisa's frustration grew. She scribbled a note and passed it to an assistant, pushed the heritage angle. "Make him squirm." Steve, still in the dark, received the next prompt, his brow furrowing slightly at its edge. "You've got Lebanese roots, Jonathan, and you're proud of that. But some folks online, they're not so kind. They say you're too foreign to play Jesus, too tied to a culture they don't get. How do you handle that noise?" The question was a dagger crafted by Lisa to exploit anti-Middle Eastern sentiment and paint Jonathan as an outsider. The audience tensed, some gasping at the bluntness, others whispering. Lisa leaned forward, expecting Jonathan to falter under the weight of prejudice. Jonathan's eyes flickered with a quiet pain, the kind that comes from hearing slurs disguised as questions. He'd faced this before casting directors who'd dismissed him as two ethnic, social media trolls who'd mocked his heritage. But he leaned forward, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Steve, I've heard those voices my whole life," he said. "They say I don't belong because of where my family's from, because I look different, because I pray different. But Jesus was a Middle Eastern man, born in a land not so different from my ancestors. If I'm too foreign to play him, then maybe the problem's not with me, it's with the mirror they're holding." The words cut through the room like a blade of light, sharp yet healing. The audience erupted in applause, some standing their cheers, drowning out Lisa's muttered curse backstage. Steve's face broke into a wide grin, his hand slapping the armrest. "That's how you shut it down," he said, pointing at Jonathan. "Preach that truth." But Lisa's plan wasn't dead yet. She signaled for the next question, one meant to paint Jonathan as a hypocrite. Steve, caught in the moment's energy, read the prompt with less hesitation. "Now, Jonathan, you talk about faith, but you're in Hollywood making good money playing Jesus. Ain't it a little convenient to preach humility when you're living the good life?" The question, dripping with Lisa's venom, aimed to expose Jonathan as a fraud, leveraging the stereotype of a sanctimonious actor profiting off religion. The audience quieted, curious, while Lisa smirked, certain she'd finally cornered him. Jonathan reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn. "Steve, I'm glad you asked," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "This is my bank statement from last month. Balance, $1.847. The audience gasped, a wave of shock rippling through the studio. Steve's jaw dropped, his eyes wide. Lisa's smirk vanished, her face paling. "I live in the same Chicago apartment I've had for 8 years, Jonathan continued. "I drive a 15-year-old Honda. I give away most of what I earn because Jesus didn't call me to build wealth. He called me to build his kingdom." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The audience began to clap, slowly at first, then thunderously, some wiping tears. Steve leaned back, shaking his head in awe. "Man, you're the real deal," he said, his voice thick with respect. But Lisa, furious at her plans unraveling, scribbled another note, cut to commercial. Regroup. She wasn't done. She'd rewrite the next segment to mock Jonathan's faith as fanaticism, maybe even edit the footage to make him seem unhinged. But Jonathan, sensing the battle wasn't over, turned to Steve, his voice softer now, carrying a new weight. "Steve, there's something else I need to say," he said, his eyes locking onto the crucifix. "Something I've never told anyone before." The audience leaned in the air, electric with anticipation. Steve nodded, his preacher's instinct sensing a shift. "Go on, brother," he said. Lisa in the wings froze, her pen hovering over her clipboard. She hadn't planned for this. Jonathan took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "A few years ago, I was in a dark place," he began. "I didn't know if I could keep going. And then I saw you, Steve, on a screen, wearing that crucifix, talking about pain and purpose. And it changed everything." The studio fell silent, every eye on Jonathan, every heart waiting for what came next. Lisa's plan was crumbling, and the truth was about to shine brighter than her prejudice could ever dim. The studio of the Steve Harvey Show was a crucible of emotion, the air heavy with the weight of truth. Jonathan Roumie sat across from Steve Harvey, his Bible still in his lap, his eyes reflecting a quiet resolve. Steve, visibly moved by Jonathan's humility in defiance of prejudice, leaned forward, unaware of the venomous glare from producer Lisa Bennett in the wings. Her plan to humiliate Jonathan for his faith in Lebanese heritage was unraveling, and her fury grew with every clap from the audience. She'd tried to paint him as a zealot, a hypocrite, but his authenticity had turned the tables. Now, as Jonathan began to share a deeply personal story, the studio held its breath, sensing something sacred was unfolding. Lisa's trap was failing, and what Jonathan said next would not only touch Steve's heart, but begin to expose her malice to the world. Jonathan's voice softened, carrying a vulnerability that silenced the room. "Steve, a few years ago, I hit a place so dark I didn't know if I could climb out." He said, his eyes drifting to the crucifix on Steve's chest. The audience leaned in, their earlier cheers replaced by a reverent hush. Steve's hand instinctively touched the cross, his preacher's soul sensing the gravity of the moment. Lisa backstage clenched her clipboard, her plan to cut to commercial, thwarted by the floor director's hesitation. Even he was captivated. She hissed to an assistant, "Get ready to spin this as melodrama. He's playing the victim." But Jonathan's words were no performance. They were a testimony that would shatter her schemes. "I was struggling," Jonathan continued, his voice steady but raw. "Not just with work, but with who I was. I'd faced rejection in Hollywood, casting calls where I was too ethnic, auditions where my faith made people uncomfortable. I'd heard slurs about my Lebanese roots, whispers that I didn't belong, and then personal losses piled up." He paused, his gaze distant, as if reliving the pain. "My father passed believing I'd never make it. A close friend battled cancer, and I felt helpless. I started questioning everything, my purpose, my faith, even if God still saw me." The audience was silent, some wiping tears, others clutching hands, feeling the weight of his words. Steve's eyes glistened, his hand still on the crucifix. "Man, I know that darkness," he said softly. Jonathan nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "One night I was done," he said. "I couldn't sleep, couldn't pray. I just sat in my apartment staring at nothing, wondering if it was worth going on. Then I picked up my phone, scrolling to drown out the silence. And that's when I found you, Steve." The room froze, every eye locked on him. Lisa's face twisted, her plan slipping further from her grasp. She muttered to herself, "He's turning this into a sermon. We'll edit it to make him look unhinged." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice gaining strength. "It was a clip of you, Steve, from an old show. You were talking about pain, about how God doesn't waste it. You said, if you're still breathing, God's not done with you yet. And you were wearing that crucifix right there." He pointed gently at Steve's chest. "I don't know why, but I watched it 3 times. Your voice, it wasn't just words. It was like you'd lived that pain, like you were speaking to me sitting in that dark room." Steve's lips parted, a tear escaping down his cheek. The audience stirred, some whispering amen, others nodding through their own tears. "You said God uses the broken, the ones nobody expects," Jonathan continued. "And that night, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. Not because I had answers, but because I felt seen." The words hit Steve like a wave, his hand tightening around the crucifix. "I never told anyone this," Jonathan said, his voice softer now, "but I've carried your words with me ever since. That crucifix you wear, it's not just jewelry. It's a lighthouse, Steve, guiding people like me back to hope." The audience erupted in applause, some standing their cheers, a rebuke to Lisa's cold calculations backstage. Steve wiped his eyes, his voice cracking. "Man, I was just talking from the heart," he said. "I had no idea." Jonathan shook his head, his expression earnest. "That's what made it real. You weren't trying to save me, you were just being you. And that's what pulled me through." Lisa, now visibly rattled, scribbled furiously, planning to salvage her narrative by editing Jonathan's story into a tear-jerking ploy. But the audience's reaction was overwhelming, their emotional connection to Jonathan's truth, drowning out her schemes. An assistant whispered to her, "The social media team says viewers are loving him. We can't cut this." Lisa's jaw tightened, her control slipping. Jonathan's voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "Steve, there's something else," he said, his eyes locking onto the host's. "That night I wasn't just fighting my own demons. I was fighting the voices that said I didn't belong because of my faith, my heritage. People like—" He paused, glancing briefly toward the wings where Lisa stood, her face paling, as if sensing the spotlight turning. "People who judged me before I even spoke. But your words, your faith reminded me that God sees me even when others don't." The audience gasped, some following his glance, sensing the unspoken accusation. Steve's brow furrowed, catching the hint of something amiss, but he stayed focused on Jonathan. Lisa's panic surged. She signaled frantically to the director, mouthing, "Cut him off." But the director, moved by the moment, ignored her, letting the cameras roll. Jonathan turned back to Steve, his voice steady but piercing. "You said, sometimes you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. I need you to know, Steve, you rescued me that night. And I'm here to tell you, you're more than a host. You're a minister in disguise." Steve's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as tears fell freely. The audience stood their applause, thunderous, a wave of love and affirmation washing over the stage. Lisa's plan was in tatters. She stormed toward the control room, determined to salvage her narrative by any means, perhaps a last-minute question to trip Jonathan or a post-show edit to mock his faith. But the audience's reaction, now trending on social media with hashtags like Jonathan Speaks Truth, was beyond her control. Steve, wiping his face, looked at Jonathan with awe. "You remembered all that?" he asked, his voice thick. Jonathan nodded, his smile gentle. "I had to, because it wasn't just words, it was life." The studio felt transformed, no longer a stage, but a sanctuary where truth had triumphed over prejudice. But the battle wasn't over. Lisa's malice lingered, her determination to ruin Jonathan undimmed. As Steve prepared to respond, Jonathan's eyes flickered toward the wings again, sensing her next move. He leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "Steve, there's one more thing I need to tell you," he said. "Something that might change your life like you changed mine." The audience held its breath. Lisa froze, and the cameras zoomed in, capturing a moment that would not only deepen the bond between two men, but begin to expose the darkness lurking behind the scenes. The studio of the Steve Harvey Show was no longer just a stage. It had become a sanctuary where truth resonated like a hymn. Jonathan Roumie sat across from Steve Harvey, his Bible a quiet anchor in his lap, his eyes radiating compassion and resolve. Steve, tears still glistening on his cheeks, gripped the crucifix around his neck, overwhelmed by Jonathan's story of how his words had pulled him from despair. The audience, standing in a wave of applause, felt the sacred weight of the moment, their cheers a testament to the power of authenticity. But in the shadows of the wings, producer Lisa Bennett seethed her carefully laid trap to humiliate Jonathan for his faith and Lebanese heritage now in ruins. Her prejudice had been exposed, if only subtly, and her control was slipping. As Jonathan prepared to share one final revelation, the stage was set for a reckoning that would not only transform Steve, but begin to bring Lisa's malice into the open, setting the stage for her downfall. Steve, his voice thick with emotion, leaned forward, his hand still clutching the crucifix. "Jonathan, you're killing me, man," he said, half laughing through his tears. "I was just trying to make it like everybody else, and you're telling me I helped save you," the audience murmured in agreement, some wiping their eyes, others nodding in silent reverence. Jonathan smiled, his expression gentle but unwavering. "That's exactly why it works, Steve," he said. "You weren't trying to be a hero. You were just being real, carrying that cross, speaking from your scars. And that's what God used." Lisa in the wings was a storm of rage and desperation. Her plan to mock Jonathan's faith and heritage had backfired spectacularly. Social media was ablaze with praise for Jonathan, with posts like, "This man's faith is unstoppable," and "The Jonathan Roumie shines," trending worldwide. Her attempts to signal the director to cut the segment had been ignored, and now she was scrambling to salvage her narrative. She whispered to an assistant, "Prep a gotcha question for the end, something to make him look like a fanatic, and get the editors ready to chop this into something we can spin." But her voice trembled, betraying her fear that the tide had turned. Jonathan, sensing the tension from backstage, turned to Steve, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Steve, there's one more thing I need to tell you," he said, his eyes locking onto the host's. "Something that might change your life, like you changed mine." The audience fell silent, the air electric with anticipation. Steve's eyes widened, his preacher's instinct kicking in. "I'm listening, brother," he said, his voice steady but filled with awe. Lisa froze, her clipboard slipping slightly in her hands. She hadn't anticipated this, another unscripted moment that could derail her control. Jonathan took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "That night I found your video, I wasn't just fighting my own darkness," he said. "I was fighting the voices that told me I was less than because of my faith, because of my Lebanese blood. Voices like the ones I heard when I got here today." The audience gasped, some turning toward the wings where Lisa stood, her face draining of color. Steve's brow furrowed, sensing the weight of Jonathan's words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft but searching. Jonathan's gaze flickered briefly toward Lisa, then back to Steve. "Before I came on, someone told me not to turn this into a church service." He said, his tone calm but pointed. "They said my heritage, my faith didn't belong here, that I was just a religious actor who'd be laughed off the stage." The audience stirred, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the crowd. Some glared toward the wings, piecing together the tension. Lisa's assistant shrank back, sensing the spotlight shifting. Lisa herself stood rigid, her eyes darting to the control room, willing the director to cut to commercial. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second. Steve's face hardened, his hand tightening around the crucifix. "Who said that to you?" he asked, his voice low, a protective edge emerging. Jonathan shook his head gently, his expression forgiving, but firm. "It doesn't matter who he said. What matters is what I learned from you. In that video you said, God doesn't always call the qualified, he qualifies the called. You said pain is a language, and when someone who's been through it speaks, it cuts through the noise." Steve nodded, his eyes glistening again, the memory of that speech flooding back. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice gaining strength. "Steve, you were speaking that language when you saved me, and you're speaking it now, whether you know it or not. That crucifix you wear, it's not just a symbol. It's a signal, a beacon for people like me. People who've been judged, pushed aside, told they don't belong. You're not just a host, Steve. You're a minister carrying hope to places where it's been forgotten." The audience erupted, standing once more, their applause a roar of affirmation. Some shouted amen while others wept, openly moved by the truth in Jonathan's words. Steve's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as he tried to hold himself together. "Man, you're messing me up," he said, his voice breaking. He wiped his face, looking at Jonathan with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I never saw myself like that. I'm just a comedian trying to get through my own mess." Jonathan smiled, his eyes warm. "That's why God chose you," he said. "Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's. It sounds like someone who's been in the dark, who knows what it's like to struggle. And that's what reaches people." Lisa's panic reached a fever pitch. She stormed toward the control room, barking orders to prepare a final question that would discredit Jonathan, perhaps a jab at his exclusivist faith or a dig at his foreign perspective. But her assistant hesitated, whispering, "The audience is eating this up. Cutting him now will tank our ratings." Lisa's eyes blazed, but she knew she was losing ground. The social media team reported that viewers were calling Jonathan's story a miracle on air, with some even questioning the show's treatment of him, citing his earlier glance toward the wings. The hashtag #WhoJudgedJonathan began trending, and Lisa's name was starting to surface in whispers online. Jonathan, unaware of the digital storm brewing, turned to Steve, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Steve, I need you to hear this," he said. "You've doubted yourself, haven't you? Wondered if all this comedy hosting, speaking really matters?" Steve nodded slowly, his eyes raw with vulnerability. "All the time, man," he admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough to talk about faith, not clean enough, not steady enough." Jonathan's expression softened further. "That's exactly why God uses you," he said, "because your scars make your words real, and I'm living proof." The audience was a sea of emotion, some holding hands, others praying silently. Steve's lips trembled, his hands still on the crucifix. "You remembered all that he asked," his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded, his smile radiant. Every word. Because it wasn't just a speech, it was a lifeline. He paused, then added, "And now, Steve, I want to give those words back to you, because maybe you've forgotten their power." The studio held its breath, Lisa's schemes fading into irrelevance as the moment deepened. Steve leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jonathan's. "Go ahead," he said, his voice trembling. Jonathan's voice was steady, reverent, as he began to recite Steve's own words from that long-ago video. "God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect," he said. "Sometimes he picks the broken, the ones nobody expects, because they know how to reach hearts the strong can't." Steve's eyes closed, the words washing over him like a tide. "You don't need a pulpit to preach," Jonathan continued. "You don't need a robe to be called. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and your comedy is just the disguise God uses to send hope." Steve's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as tears fell freely. No shame in his surrender. The audience stood again, their applause. A sacred chorus drowning out Lisa's frantic whispers in the control room. She was losing everything, her narrative, her control, her reputation. But Jonathan wasn't done. He looked at Steve, his voice soft but piercing. "Steve, you're a minister, whether you see it or not. And that crucifix, it's pointing to something bigger than both of us." Steve looked up, his face a mix of awe and humility. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Jonathan leaned in, his eyes steady. "I have something to tell you, Steve. Something that might change your life, like you changed mine." The cameras zoomed in, the audience held its breath, and Lisa's world began to crumble as the truth prepared to shine brighter than her prejudice could ever dim. The studio of the Steve Harvey Show was a sacred space transformed by the raw honesty of Jonathan Roumie and Steve Harvey's tearful embrace of his unspoken calling. Jonathan, his Bible still a quiet presence, had just recited Steve's own words back to him, affirming that his comedy was a ministry, his crucifix a beacon of hope. Steve, overwhelmed, clutched the cross around his neck, his eyes glistening with a mix of awe and humility. The audience stood in reverent silence, their applause a fading echo, their hearts stirred by a moment that felt like worship. But in the shadows, producer Lisa Bennett's malice burned hotter than ever. Her plan to humiliate Jonathan for his Christian faith and Lebanese heritage had collapsed, and now with social media ablaze with praise for him, her prejudice was on the verge of exposure. As Jonathan prepared to deliver one final revelation, the stage was set for a conclusion that would not only cement a bond of grace, but deliver a resounding punishment to Lisa, satisfying the audience's hunger for justice. Steve, his voice still trembling, looked at Jonathan, his hand resting over the crucifix. "What do you mean, something that'll change my life?" he asked, his tone soft but urgent. The audience leaned in, sensing the weight of what was coming. Jonathan's eyes were steady, filled with a quiet fire. "Steve, you've carried this cross, this faith into places where hope was dying," he said. "But you've also carried pain, doubt, fear that you're not enough. I know because I've felt it too." He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience, then returning to Steve. "That night, your words saved me. You said something else. Sometimes you're not the one being rescued, you're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. I'm here to tell you, Steve, you're rescuing millions and it's time you believed it." The audience erupted, their cheers a tidal wave of affirmation. Steve's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as he absorbed the truth. "Man, I don't deserve this," he whispered. But Jonathan shook his head, his voice firm. "It's not about deserving, Steve. It's about God choosing you, broken, scarred, real. You're his minister, whether you wear a suit or a robe." Steve looked up, his eyes wet but radiant, and for a moment the studio felt like a church, the air alive with grace. The cameras captured every second, but backstage Lisa Bennett was a storm of panic. Her plan to derail Jonathan had failed, and now her prejudice was becoming a liability. Social media was exploding with Uraturna, Nawath who judged Jonathan, with viewers speculating about the someone who tried to silence him. Her name was starting to surface, and she knew it. Lisa stormed into the control room, her voice a hiss. "Cut to commercial now." She barked, but the director, moved by the moment, shook his head. "The audience is glued, Lisa. This is gold." Her eyes blazed, but she was cornered. She grabbed her phone, texting her editing team, "Salvage this. Make him look like a fanatic. Bury his story." But even her team hesitated, aware that the raw authenticity of Jonathan's words was untouchable. The assistant producer, who'd overheard Lisa's earlier slurs against Jonathan's faith and heritage, slipped out, whispering to a colleague about her boss's bias. The whispers spread, reaching the social media team, who were already fielding tweets demanding answers about the show's treatment of Jonathan. On stage, Jonathan's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "Steve, there's one last thing," he said, his eyes locking onto the hosts. "That night when I was lost, I wasn't just fighting my own doubts. I was fighting the voices that said I didn't belong because of my faith, because of my Lebanese roots. Voices that judged me before I spoke, that mocked my cross, my Christ." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the wings, where Lisa had retreated, her silhouette barely visible. "Today I heard those voices again, trying to silence me. But your words, your faith reminded me that God's truth is louder than any prejudice." The audience gasped, their eyes darting toward the wings. Steve's face hardened, his preacher's instinct sensing the injustice. "Who tried to silence you, brother?" he asked, his voice low, protective. Jonathan shook his head gently, his expression forgiving but resolute. "It's not about naming names," he said. "It's about what you taught me. Pain is a language, and when you speak it with faith, it breaks through. You broke through to me, Steve, and now you're breaking through to millions. Don't ever stop. The audience stood again, their applause a roar of love, some shouting hallelujah, as tears streamed down their faces. Steve stood unable to stay seated and opened his arms. Jonathan rose and the two men embraced, not as host and guest, but as brothers bound by grace. The studio shook with cheers, the moment transcending television. But the real storm was brewing backstage. The assistant producer, fed up with Lisa's malice, had leaked her earlier comments to a trusted journalist in the audience. Within minutes, a tweet went viral. Producer Lisa Bennett allegedly mocked Jonathan Roumie's faith in Lebanese heritage before his Steve Harvey interview. Justice for Jonathan. The hashtag soared, joined by screenshots of internal messages where Lisa had called Jonathan a religious nut and too foreign for mainstream TV. The internet erupted, demanding accountability. As the show wrapped, Steve turned to the audience, his voice cracked but powerful. "I've had a lot of moments on this stage," he said, "but this was God's hand at work." He looked at Jonathan, then at the crucifix, and whispered, "Let's pray." The audience bowed their heads, and Steve led a simple prayer for hope, healing, and courage. Jonathan joined in, his voice steady, and for a moment the studio was a cathedral where faith triumphed over division. The cameras faded to black, but the story was far from over. In the days that followed, Lisa's world collapsed. The leaked messages sparked a firestorm, with viewers and celebrities alike condemning her prejudice. Major networks picked up the story, headlining it, "Talk show producer faces backlash for discriminating against the chosen star." Sponsors threatened to pull funding from the Steve Harvey show unless action was taken. Steve, learning the full extent of Lisa's actions, issued a public statement. "There's no place for hate on my set. Faith and heritage are to be honored, not mocked." Within 48 hours, Lisa was fired, her career in tatters. She issued a half-hearted apology, but the public's outrage was unrelenting. Her name synonymous with bigotry. Her social media accounts were deleted under a barrage of criticism, and industry insiders shunned her, ensuring she'd never work in television again. Jonathan, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life in Chicago, his humility unchanged. The viral interview brought new viewers to The Chosen, but he stayed focused on his calling, answering every fan letter with care. One letter from a young Lebanese-American girl touched him deeply. "You showed me I can be proud of my faith and my roots, even when people hate me for it. Thank you for standing tall." Jonathan wept, grateful for the chance to reflect Christ's love. Steve, emboldened by the experience, began weaving more faith into his show, unafraid of critics. He invited Jonathan back for a follow-up where they laughed, prayed, and celebrated the God who uses the broken to heal. The interview became a cultural landmark, viewed over 600 million times, not for its drama, but for its truth. Comments poured in from around the world, stories of people inspired to embrace their faith, confront prejudice, or simply keep going. A pastor in Nigeria wrote, "Steve and Jonathan showed us that God's microphone is louder than hate." The hashtag "Reassure Faith Over Fear" trended for weeks, a testament to the power of authenticity. Lisa's downfall was a stark warning: prejudice, when exposed, reaps its own destruction. For Jonathan and Steve, the moment was a victory not of pride, but of grace, a reminder that God's light shines brightest in the darkest corners. The story of that day continues to ripple, touching lives no course or empire could reach. Sometimes the greatest triumphs come not from winning arguments, but from speaking truth with love. For those still searching, the invitation remains: step into the light, where faith overcomes fear and grace outlasts hate.